Hi, my name is Ed Freeland. I am the Associate Director of the Survey Research Center at Princeton University in Princeton, New Jersey. Today I want to talk about what I'm calling the paradox of data sharing and data privacy in the social sciences. The main idea of my talk is that the movement for open science and data sharing, while its intent is to strengthen the legitimacy of science, paradoxically contributes to a confluence of trends that may end up undermining public confidence in science. So what is the movement for open science? It's a movement among scientists, government officials, and foundation officers who, for a variety of reasons, would like to see science clean up its act. This includes measures to reduce fraud and prevent the publication of study results that cannot be reasonably replicated. It's intended to stop the practice of burying results of studies when those studies don't work out as expected, which happens more often than you might think. This reflects a concern about maximizing the return of public investment in science. If a research study is funded by the public should have access to information about the study, regardless of whether or not the results are disappointing. There's also the simple, laudable goal of strengthening the integrity of scientific work, which is essential for how the public perceives scientists. The growth of the internet now allows for completely new innovations, such as crowdsourced science and citizen science. That means putting a lot more open access data out there on the web. But that makes it possible for hundreds or thousands of people working remotely to make small contributions to a research study that produces big results that wouldn't otherwise be possible. It also enables scientists to participate in wider global networks of collaborative research. What were some of the things that prompted the open science movement? First is a number of well-known conflict of interest cases in which scientists were found to have had undisclosed financial interests, received funds from inappropriate sources, or had inappropriate ties to foreign governments. Next was a number of high-profile cases of plagiarism, fraud, and retractions of published scientific papers. The most recent example being the high-profile retraction of papers published in The Lancet, a British medical journal, and the New England Journal of Medicine. These studies were based on data from Surgisphere, a company that collects massive amounts of data from hospitals around the world. Because the company would not cooperate with independent reviewers who requested access to the raw data, the study authors requested that the journals retract the studies that were based on the Surgisphere data. My field, the science of polling and survey research, took a pretty serious public relations hit after the 2016 presidential election. Many of the state polls that were aggregated in order to estimate the outcome of the election pointed toward a victory for Hillary Clinton. And as everyone knows, that things didn't quite work out that way. Even though many of the problems in the industry have now been cleared up, in part through an effort known within the profession as the Transparency Initiative, we're seeing even greater levels of cynicism in the general public in the current round of pre-election polling. There are also a number of recent cases involving studies which had well-publicized results, but turned out to be difficult to replicate. These cases set off a big debate within science about the practice of p-hacking and the use of arbitrarily set statistical criteria for rejecting null hypotheses. As we all know, anybody can use data, even purely random data, to run 100 regression models and get 4 or 5 statistically significant results. Clearly, we need systems in place to prevent those results from becoming 4 or 5 published papers in scientific journals. This is the Center for Open Science at the University of Virginia. It's now become common practice for researchers to go to this website or to clinicaltrials.gov to pre-register their data analysis plans and hypotheses at the outset of their research. And many journals now require this, as well as IRB review, as a precondition for reviewing articles for publication. And here's the clinical trials website. As you can see, it's gotten quite large, more than 350,000 scientific studies registered there. That's a great development to see in terms of public access. Opportunities for preserving and archiving data have expanded greatly over the past decade. That's meant rethinking the typical endpoint of a study, which used to be publication of results, but now includes publication of the data and the code used for the analysis as well. There's also been a growth in the number of locations around the country that provide restricted access to census data and data from the IRS and other agencies that are now available to researchers. When it comes to the preparation of public use files, however, there are no definitive standards for how to do this. There's not much beyond the obvious deletion of explicit identifiers, such as the ones listed in the HIPAA standards. There's also things like top coding, collapsing categories, and geographic masking that can be used to prevent identification of study subjects through inference. That's all led to a concern about whether or not anonymization of data actually works. At my center, we now avoid using the term anonymous as much as possible and refer to our data protection measures as confidential. There are still problems, though. There's been tremendous growth in the volume and accessibility of personal information available on the internet. Political parties and many corporations have built up massive data files that know a lot about you and me. And the US is way behind Europe when it comes to regulating this industry. As for handling confidential data in our own work, it's best to assume all data are potentially identifiable. All this adds up to a pretty serious challenge to the confidence of the general public when it comes to protecting privacy. We know from surveys that public trust in science has held pretty steady over the years, but there's still not a lot of confidence in the organizations that are responsible for protecting data with personal information. That's reflected in the declining response rates in surveys, as well as growing hostility to government data collection. You can see from the survey data here that credit card companies are trusted more than government agencies when it comes to keeping personal data secure. But overall, less than half the public says they are somewhat or very confident in the ability of either credit card companies or the government to protect that information. More recent data from the Pew Research Center show that large majorities of Americans feel they have very little control over their personal information and a real lack of understanding in when, where, and how this information gets used. One of the great stories of public opinion research has been the long, slow decline in public trust of major social institutions, especially different branches of the government, over the last 70 years. That's even true of declining confidence in medical science, as you can see here. But confidence in science more generally has held up remarkably well. Nevertheless, one could be fooled by looking at the mean values year over year. You get a much different picture when you split this dark blue line out by political orientation. This figure shows that while the mean or overall trend has been steady, conservatives and liberals are moving in opposite directions, with conservatives being more distrustful of science over time and liberals becoming more trusting. And if you look at more recent data from the General Social Survey, you'll see this gap has gotten even wider over time. And here you can see the long-term trend in declining response rates over time for both some of the major large federal government surveys and for polls of the general public done by the Pew Research Center. This to me clearly signifies a gradual erosion of civic participation and a growing cynicism about the need for social research and statistical data collection. To get a sense of that, just go on YouTube and search for videos about the American Community Survey, one of our most important sources of data for social science research. There's a palpable and, in my view, shameful hostility out there toward the ACS, and the threat is real. These videos are having an impact. You can see here that the ACS response rates were in the high 90s from 2000 until 2015, the exception, of course, being the year 2013. But in 2016, they dropped to the low 90s, and last year, 2019, was the lowest response rate on record at 86%. If you're looking for a dead social science canary in the coal mine, this is it. Although many would argue that the attack on science has been on full display at the Centers for Disease Control during the COVID-19 pandemic, I want to focus in closing on a different agency. The paradox I've been talking about can be seen in full fruition in a set of proposed rule changes at the Environmental Protection Agency. If fully enacted, these changes will limit the admissibility of scientific studies that do not allow full access to raw data, computer code used for analysis, confidential proprietary business information, or de-identified medical records. This would give companies impacted by agency decisions a near perfect tool for discrediting any studies that might affect their bottom lines. To make matters worse, the rule changes would apply to older environmental and health studies that have impacted agency decisions on pollution rules in the past, but would no longer be allowed as evidence in future decisions. And just a few weeks ago, the agency rejected several studies on the dangers of chlorpyrifos, an ingredient in certain pesticides, due to lack of access to the raw data studies in spite of the fact that those studies were peer reviewed. All of this is to be done under the guise of improving the transparency and integrity of science. As Andrew Wheeler, the current EPA administrator, put it, good science is science that can be replicated and independently validated, science that can hold up to scrutiny. That is why we're moving forward to ensure the science supporting agency decisions is transparent and available for evaluation by the public and stakeholders. That sounds both ominous and familiar. My four main takeaways: greater availability of anonymized study data and the proliferation of public and private databases with personal identifying information increase the likelihood of harmful data disclosures. And I'm sure we're going to see more of these kinds of disclosures in the future. Those disclosures will feed into a growing cynicism about the value of data collection for social science and government statistics. The drive to increase trust in science through transparency, while laudable, means data with confidentiality protections may ultimately be viewed as less trustworthy. That creates opportunities for vested financial interests to attack science that threatens corporate profits. Thank you. My slide presentation is available at my website at the Survey Research Center. I'm also happy to take questions by email.